Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever stopped to think about this? What happens to the big names from the Old Testament, figures like King David, when we get to the end times? Well, today we're diving into a really interesting and pretty specific theological take on when exactly they're supposed to come back.
All right, so the core question the source material really gets into is, when do these Old Testament heroes actually get their resurrected bodies? I mean, we're talking about a huge debate here, and it puts them right at this critical fork in the road in the whole end times timeline.
And that question, well, it throws us right into the middle of a major debate. It's really all about the timing, right? Do these ancient heroes get resurrected with everyone else? Or is there a totally different schedule for them laid out in the Bible? A pretty common view is that these Old Testament figures have to wait it out all the way until the end of that prophesied 7-year tribulation period. But, and this is the interesting part, the source we're looking at today says, hold on a second, it totally challenges that timeline and suggests they come back much, much earlier. So, the source we're examining really hones in on this specific passage as the key. The whole argument hinges on this idea that the phrase, those who sleep in Jesus, isn't just for New Testament folks, it's for believers from all eras. And if that's the case, well, this interpretation would mean the Old Testament saints get resurrected way earlier, at the Rapture. Okay, so, if the claim is that they return at the Rapture, you've got to ask, where's the proof, right? So let's do that. Let's break down exactly how this source builds its case for this very specific timing. The whole case really rests on 4 main arguments. Think of them like 4 pillars holding up this whole idea. We're going to walk through each one, and we'll start with a really compelling one, a process of elimination. So the first point is all about King David. Prophecy says he's going to rule again during that future 1,000-year period on Earth, the millennium. But here's the thing. To do that, he's got to have his resurrected body. And that simple fact, well, it leaves us with only 2 possible times he could come back. And just like that, the timeline gets a lot simpler. We're down to 2 options. Following the logic here, David has to be resurrected either before that 7-year tribulation, which would be the rapture, or after it, at what's called the first resurrection. It's one or the other. Okay, so then the source points us to this passage in Revelation. And the argument is that the first resurrection is described in super specific detail. It's for the martyrs, right? The people who died during the tribulation because they refused to worship the beast. And that description, well, it just doesn't fit guys like King David. So you see where this is going, right? Here's the conclusion from that first point. If the first resurrection after the tribulation is specifically for the martyrs of that time, then, by process of elimination, the only other option on the table for the Old Testament saints has to be the rapture. All right, on to the second argument. This one is all about unity. The idea here is that God's plan isn't some kind of 2-track system. Old and New Testament believers aren't on separate schedules to get their resurrected bodies. No, they're supposed to be made perfect all together, at the same time. And this verse from Hebrews, man, it just perfectly illustrates the point. The source brings this up because it's talking about those ancient heroes of the faith. And the interpretation is that their final completion, their perfection, is directly tied to ours, to the New Testament believers. It's something that has to happen together. Now, the third argument kind of builds on that same idea of unity. It points to that famous passage about a great cloud of witnesses up in heaven. The source identifies this group as, you guessed it, the Old Testament saints. They're there right now as spirits, just waiting for their perfected, resurrected bodies. And for the final point, we look at the Apostle Paul's phrase, the whole family in heaven and earth. The interpretation offered here is that he's not talking about 2 separate families, one group on earth and another in heaven. No, it's one single unified family of God that stretches across all of history. So, with all this talk about the rapture, it brings up a really practical question, doesn't it? Who actually gets to go? What exactly does it take to be, rapture ready? To really get to the heart of it, the source throws out a pretty tough hypothetical scenario. Picture this. What if a believer sins at the exact moment the rapture happens? I mean, with no time to repent. Are they left behind? What happens? Well, according to this interpretation, the answer is found in that core principle of salvation by grace. The whole idea is that getting included isn't about being perfectly sinless at one specific moment in time. It's all based on a gift you receive through faith, not something you earn by your actions. So the big takeaway here is pretty huge. In this view, being ready for the rapture depends completely on your salvation status, not on being sinless at just the right second. Basically, the only ticket you need is the one you get through faith. But what happens after all this? What's next? In our final section, we're going to explore what the source says life is actually like for believers once they get to heaven.
And this leads to a question that's just so human, you know? Will we recognize each other? Do our identities, our memories, our relationships, do they carry over? Well, the source material gives a really clear answer on this. The main piece of evidence that's offered comes from the account of the Mount of Transfiguration. I mean, think about it. Peter, James, and John had never seen a photo of Moses or Elijah, obviously, yet they knew who they were instantly. So the source uses this to suggest that a whole new, much deeper kind of knowing is what's waiting for us. So the conclusion from that is pretty incredible. Recognition in heaven won't just be possible, it'll be complete and totally immediate. The idea is that with these new glorified bodies, everyone will just instantly and perfectly know who everyone else is. No name tags needed. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful thought, doesn't it? It's a vision not of being lost in a crowd, but of perfect mutual understanding. A future where we will finally know others fully, in the same way that we ourselves are fully known.